Okay. Good evening. Welcome to the latest installment of Building the Scottish State. And I have the great pleasure to have Jim Sillars with me, former SNP MP and all-around political activist. And I'd like to talk to him about today's developments and other issues as well. So first of all, thank you very much for joining us, Jim.
You're more than welcome.
Okay. So the obvious thing to start with, the Alba party. What did you just give me your reflections on it?
Well, I welcome this as a development in the independence movement. I think the SNP is pretty badly damaged with being tainted with political corruption. So I welcome a new viable political party in the independent spectrum. I also welcomed it because it's a return of Alex Salmond to the front line of politics. Now, I was Alex's biggest critic all the time he led the party from 1992 on. And he was my biggest critic as well. I don't take back any of what I said at that time, and I'm sure he doesn't either. But you get to a situation in the life of our nation when we are really at a crossroads. We've had Brexit, which alters the political equation very substantially. We've had the pandemic, in which 3 lockdowns have thrashed the economic base. And we have a potential tsunami of unemployment once all the lockdown and tier system is actually lifted. And we've got a National Health Service, which for the past year has been an NHS COVID service. And we've got lots of people with cancer and all sorts of other problems who have never been diagnosed and will need priority treatment. So we're at this crossroads, and I think it's time, old grievances have got to be put in the past, and I welcome the return of Alex Salmond because he is head and shoulders above all other politicians in Scotland. He was when he was First Minister, and he still is. Now, for the last 3 years, Alex Salmond has been turned inside out for all the public to see what he's been made of. And it must have been a traumatic experience. And I think the Salmond that was will still be the Salmond that is in terms of quality. But you have learned a great deal from perhaps the mistakes he made during his time as First Minister. And if you look at Craig Murray's evidence in court in his case, he quotes a conversation he had with Alec where Alec acknowledges that perhaps one of the mistakes he made was this incredible centralisation of decision making. So I think we're going to see a better Alex Salmond in the run-up to the election and after it on the 6th of May. So it's a welcome as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. And how do you think it's going to change the dynamics of Parliament? Say, for example, there's maybe an SNP slight minority, and then maybe the Alba party has maybe 20, 25 seats. I don't know how many is reasonable to expect. How do you see that changing the dynamics of the Parliament?
If that happens, then the SNP will have had a hell of a lesson at the hands of the electorate. It will be a message to the SNP, you better be better this time round. And by the way, there is an alternative sitting there called Alba. And if you don't match up, then Alba will take over from the SNP. My own hope, I'm still a member of the SNP, my own hope is that the electors will make the membership of the SNP wake up to what has been happening through the cult of personality of Nicola Sturgeon and the political corruption that has developed inside the SNP and to some extent the Scottish government. And that the party membership will perhaps see that there might be some merit in having a federal independence party with the SNP and Alba being in the federal relationship rather than a separate but complementary relationship. That would, from my point of view, that would be the ideal situation. I would like to see the electorate deliver a lesson that would enable reconstruction of the SNP and an acceptance of Alba being a legitimate partner in the independence movement. That's my hope, but the big difference between hope and reality.
And what do you see as leaving aside the corruption? How do you see the different leadership styles between Sturgeon and Salmond, and why do you feel that he is such a a superior politician?
Well, these are X factors, Mark. Mm-hmm. There are intangibles matter in this world. You either have the gravitas and the wider intellectual lateral ability, or you don't have it. Mm. Salmond's got it. Nicola's a damn good brief reader. Mm. But where is any record of imagination, any ability to reach out beyond her own narrow core of supporters to a wider group in Scottish society, to not just be a party leader, but a national leader? I think Salmond has the ability to be a national leader. Now, he failed last time because he was a very good party leader. But as the 2014 referendum showed, he wasn't wide enough at that time to be a party leader. I think Alec must, having come out, as it were, and had time to reflect, must understand that it's okay to knock 7 bells out of the opposition at a big party speech. But you've got to be able to make speeches and signal to people who are not with you at a present time that you understand where they're coming from. And that's one of the ways you win them over, by becoming a national leader. I think Salmond's got that potential. I don't think Nicola has it at all.
And having served with having served with Salmond in Westminster, how did you see him operate, and what gives you the faith and confidence that he could be a very good national leader?
He is intellectually sound, and he has the merit, which is missing in most politicians, of applying intellectual rigor to subjects. So you don't get superficiality from Alex Salmond when you come to policy. It really is examined from A to Z and from Z to A, and he's worked out exactly what the weaknesses and what the strengths are and how to overcome the weaknesses in policy. And the other thing that people forget, Alex Salmond's a political economist. Now, that is an economist who understands politics. And that's a huge, huge asset, because our next case for independence is going to have to include a major element, once again, of the economic case for independence. And I can't think of anyone better than Alec, not only on his own, but to bring in other people who respect him as an economist.
Yeah, okay. A couple of questions. Do you think the other AFI and ISP should stand down because the Alba party has been created? And is Alex comeback good or bad for the independence cause? I think we've answered that. But what do you think? What do you think regarding the other smaller independence parties that have come up?
Well, the answer is yes, and I'll tell you why. They're all list the same as Alba. Now, I have experience of the difficulty of being elected on the list. Not me, but Margot McDonald, my wife. A list region contains a number of constituencies. I'll give you Margot's example. Lothian region had 9 parliamentary constituencies, 360,000 electors. Margot wasn't a party. Margot had no branch members anywhere. It's extremely expensive to cover 9 constituencies. You don't have the organisation to do it, and you need a lot of money. We had 40 workers, and I think something like, I mean, this is from memory, about 15,000 or 20,000 pounds, which over 9 constituencies is really nothing. But we had Margot. So if Margot called a press conference, the press would turn up. So that meant her platform was known and loads and loads of publicity attached to that. There was a chap came down from the northeast, the fisherman, decided to put up an independence candidate in Grampian. And he come down for us to brief him. And very nice guy, and you would have thought, fishing industry, the fishermen are putting forward a guy from the fishing industry in Grampian, all about fish. He didn't make it. Because you get yourself nominated and you come out and you're facing 9 constituencies, 360,000 election addresses, and you have no money in relation to the real problem of that. Now, those other small parties, I don't decry their motivation in any way whatsoever, but they're in the same position as the fishermen. Salmond, on the other hand, is like Margot. He can command publicity tomorrow morning. So he doesn't need, he'll probably get more money, but he doesn't need as much money as they do in order to make his message clear to everybody in each region. So I think it'd be very sensible if they dismantled and joined Alba. Because where is the difference between them and Alba? They want a supermajority too. Who is more likely to get it? And if they remain in, let's say they take 1%, that 1% can make a difference as to whether or not we ratchet up on the independent side more list seats. It's an unpleasant position to be in. I understand that. But if you want to engage in politics, then you have to understand realpolitik, and that's realpolitik.
Can you explain to me a little, just to understand the mechanics of it? So when Margot was running, you mentioned because there's how many wait, she was running in the list seats, right?
Yep.
Okay, and how many districts are there for the list seats?
Well, in Lothian at that, I don't know what it's like now, but I mean, it's usually the same all over. Okay. They run 9 parliamentary constituencies.
Okay, I understand now. Okay.
She was standing in 9 parliamentary constituencies as a regional, and she had the advantage of her name was on the list, you know. But those small parties will be a party name on the list, who no one has ever heard of. And knows nothing about, and they don't have, and they don't have the funds to even probably to get just mailers out to everybody. So it's far better if whatever ability they have, it's ability that's going to be required as well as, you know, people out in the street. Far better joining Alba, and then we concentrate on the list. It's Alba we vote for.
Okay. All right. And how do you, assuming they do get a substantial number of seats and there's a good supermajority for independents, of independents supporting MSPs, what do you see as the mechanics of getting a referendum or finding some way like the manifesto for Indy for achieving independence? Because I've been, over the past years, certain SNP politicians have said, well, the more support we get for the SNP, the more it'll put pressure on Boris Johnson to grant a Section 30. I didn't really subscribe to that. I don't see Boris Johnson as, particularly democratic in that respect. But in Salmon's remarks, he didn't seem to tie himself too closely to a Section 30 order. And I was just wondering, how you saw that playing out, assuming they do get a supermajority. If they do you think that would lead to a Section 30, or would another way need to be found?
I think I just turn that off. I think what we require is some degree of sophistication, Mark. Let's assume we have the supermajority. Johnson is going to say no anyway. So then what do? Well, one of the things you do is you take stock. And I know people that would become very impatient. And at 83 years old, I've got more cause for impatience than anybody else. But if it takes 2 or 3 years to get something right in the life of a nation, and you get the right result at the end of it, that is what matters. He says no, and folks say, right, plan B. We run our own independent referendum. And all the people who don't want to vote for independence, boycott it. It's got no status or no standing whatsoever. If you try it, I would imagine somebody like, say, Adam Tompkins, who's a professor of law, goes to the Court of Session and says the Scottish Parliament and government is acting ultra vires because the question of the Constitution is reserved to Westminster. And you go to the Court of Session, and the Court of Session says, let's say they say, no, they are not acting ultra vires. The UK government then appeals the Court of Session. Most unlikely, by the way, but nevertheless, let's assume the judges come down in our favour. You go to the Supreme Court, and I would advise anybody to go and read the Miller cases in the Supreme Court. The one thing that sticks out, the judges won't budge from: Westminster is sovereign.
Exactly.
Scotland is devolved. And Westminster's sovereignty is over the Constitution. So, you're bumped out there. Now, that can have a political benefit because the frustration grows and people are saying, hey, wait a minute, we've got a majority in Holyrood, it speaks for us. Let's say the Court of Session said we're right, and that lot down there in London, even if led by a Scot, says no, so you get a build-up. What do you do then? Now, some people are arguing that you say, well, we're not going to bother with that referenda any longer. We're just going to go for negotiation. Right? But you don't have a mandate for negotiation. And I doubt very much in the manifestos we're going to see from the SNP, Alba and the Greens, they're going to ask for a mandate to negotiate. They're going to ask for the mandate's all about referenda. So you don't actually have the mandate to negotiate. Now, there's something you can do if you're in a supermajority. You can actually, under the Scotland Act, collapse the Parliament and have new elections. And this time, you can put up first paragraph, we are asking you to give us a mandate to negotiate independence. This is not about a referendum. Bang. And you get the mandate then. Suppose, you then have another supermajority, this time with a mandate for negotiating. But what if Westminster will not negotiate? Are you in a UDI position? Now, getting into a UDI position depends on whether you've got critical mass in favour of independence. And by that, I would define that as round about 65 to 70%. If you have critical mass, it becomes very difficult for Westminster not to negotiate, because you can go to the Court of Session and probably get them to make a declaration that you have the right to negotiate. I'll give you an analogy from Poland of the importance of critical mass. When Lech Walesa established Solidarity Trade Union, it was declared illegal and it was suppressed, and the members of the leadership were oppressed. Solidarity, nevertheless, built up until it had 10 million members in one trade union. This is communist Poland. When it hit 10 million, the communist Supreme Court had to recognize it. Now, if we were at critical mass, let's say 65 to 70%, absolutely solid, we had collapsed the cabinet, 70% had voted us back in on a mandate to negotiate, Boris Johnson's in a very, very difficult position. Because although I know that most Scottish nationalists tend to despise Westminster and think they're a bunch, but in the island of Great Britain, the culture is the same both sides of the border, and that is a belief in democracy. Now, I would argue that as well as trying to get the critical mass, you mobilise internationally as well, because you want to bring as much international pressure. Now, what does the British government do? They boast about our democracy. They promote democracy to other parts of the world. And if they were faced with a supermajority for negotiations, where they're telling the rest of the world, be democratic, but we're not going to be democratic here, they're in a very, very difficult position. But fundamental to that is critical mass. And we have to, we have to set aside emotion in this, take a very objective view. So 2014 to now, these have been 6.5 wasted years. There hasn't really been campaigns for Scottish independence. After Brexit, which creates an entirely new situation, no work has been done on the narrative that we would, and the policy we have to put before the people next time on the question of independence. Where are we going to locate ourselves? The SNP has glued independence to re-entry for Europe. What about Spain? Do we really believe that Spain would allow us in? Because if, for them, Scotland is the same as Catalonia.
Exactly.
Are we going to trade? Let's assume we win our independence. We've got sovereignty. We're 5 million, negotiating with about 550 million in Europe. And they say to us, yeah, you can get in if you join the euro. If you don't join the euro, you're not getting in. What option have you got? The day you join the euro, you've lost your sovereignty, as the Greeks discovered. There's a wonderful juxtaposition on the question of sovereignty inside and outside the EU between Greece and Iceland. The great crash of 2007 and 8, Iceland went bankrupt. Gordon Brown, if people remember, was threatening Iceland with terrorism laws from Britain. Iceland, yeah, they did, because Iceland financial services were involved with British funds, and Gordon Brown wanted Iceland to pay the British. Iceland said, get stuffed. And he was talking about, it's quite ridiculous. What's happened, of course, is that Iceland maintained its sovereignty. It was in EFTA, by the way, but retained its essential sovereignty over its currency, money supply, and fiscal policy. Greece was in the euro and had no control whatsoever. It got thrashed. Iceland has now recovered. Greece is about 40% down on its GDP compared to 2008. So, what are the Scots going to do if Nicola Sturgeon says independence is the same vote for re-entry? I don't think,
Well, I don't think she would be in a position to guarantee that, even if it was considered desirable. And that's what I want to get on to the next one. I see that there's a lot. I see that there's a lot of questions on diverse subjects. We'll go ahead and wait to the end to address the questions. But I did want to talk about EFTA because, as you know, I was in touch with an official from EFTA and asking about Scotland's case and if they were to under what conditions could they join. And they basically said that they're not obsessed with the notion of nationhood or statehood or exactly what it is, but the state would have to be able to negotiate its own treaties and to have the legal competence to enforce the rules of these treaties. But otherwise, they're pretty open about it. And I asked them, you know, if Scotland were, for example, to use the Manifesto for Indy in May and essentially declare independence, what would they think? And they said, you know, as long as it was democratic and legitimate and peaceful, that they would certainly consider it. All it would require was sending a letter, whoever's in charge of Scotland at that point, sending a letter to the EFTA Council requesting admission, and they would seriously consider it. And then after, they would be able to help Scotland get back into the EEA and be back in the single market. So in the very short term, this could be extremely effective. Maybe later they want to, if Scotland would want to join the EU, but not in a situation of desperation, and not in a situation where that somebody like Spain could just say no. So how do you see it, and if you can also expand what I've said, and then expand on kind of the advantages and disadvantages of being in the EU and EFTA in your view?
Well, I voted leave because I don't see any advantage in transferring your sovereignty to another organization. And that's what you actually do. People talk about sharing sovereignty. That is not true. You transfer sovereignty. And, the Greeks found that out. There's a new, and particularly after the Lisbon Treaty. The Lisbon Treaty created the European Union as a body in international law in its own right for the first time ever. It's perfectly capable in its own right of signing treaties, for example. EFTA, I wrote a pamphlet, excuse me, during the 2016 referendum, in which I urged on the SNP the policy of EFTA. There's a canard about EFTA, and they say, Norway just does what the European Union tells them to do. That is untrue. EFTA and the EU have a treaty called the EEA. It's got about 129 articles and lots of protocols. Articles 99 and 100 give the lie to Norway doing just what it's told. They are required to take account of EFTA countries' positions from the very start of policy making in the EU, because it finally has to go to a final agreement with EFTA. The other canard is that Norway has to make a big chunk of money into the EU budget. That is not correct.
That's what I understood. They can pay into programs, and they can choose what programs they want to participate in, and so they pay in that respect. But as far as I understand, that's as you say, it's not the case.
No money goes into the EU budget. What happens with Norway, for example? Norway sets up an office in Brussels, and every 5 years negotiates what it's going to give in aid to the weaker countries in the European Union. Like Poland, Lithuania, and places like that. And Norway operates its own office with that agreed chunk of money and how it's distributed. And of course, that is in the state interests of Norway, because it's making contact right throughout the developing areas of the European Union. And in the long term, that's good for Norway as well. So, and the thing about EFTA is Scotland has already been in the EEA since 1994. So we would be compliant anyway and understand all the rules anyway. The thing about EFTA, we would actually strengthen EFTA's position, because that'd be another small but vigorous, robust country, along with Norway and Iceland and Liechtenstein. And I think, that's a great advantage to EFTA. The advantage to us for EFTA, instead of the European Union, we would be like Norway. That is, we would have our own currency, our own central bank, our own monetary policy, our own fiscal policy, our own foreign policy, our own defence policy, and our own home affairs.
And the ability to sign trade deals and treaties with any other country.
EFTA, and the last time I checked, has signed free trade deals with about 30 other countries. And EFTA, being made up of small countries, has an advantage over a large organisation like the EU in doing free trade deals. Because when you come to a free trade deal, it's a question of trade-off. And the big countries have lots of vested interests, which they actually politically cannot trade off. And I'll give you an example from my own experience.
Sure.
I worked in the Arab world, and part of my responsibility was to look after the Arab interest. The Gulf Cooperation Council, for 10 years, had been having a free trade agreement discussion with the European Union. And what was the big stumbling block? It was the French aluminium industry. Because in Dubai and in Bahrain, with very low energy costs, they have huge aluminium industries. If they were allowed in a free trade agreement, the French aluminium industry would disappear. So it never happened. So there's vested interest in the big. Small countries don't have the same magnitude of vested interest. So if EFTA was doing a free trade deal with India, for example, it would be much easier than the European Union trying to do it. So the significant advantages. Well, the other advantage, of course, is that Norway keeps its fishing, and we would keep our fishing as well.
Yeah, and what would be necessary if say that we were that Scotland was able to get into the EFTA and then back in the EEA? What would be the protocols necessary to fully integrate Scotland back into the European economy? I'm assuming fishing and agriculture. What other protocols do you think would be necessary to sign with, I guess, with the EU in order to to be able to sell fish and sell agriculture and again get back into the get reintegrated into the European economy?
Well, that is part of being a member of the European Economic Area, the EEA treaty that EFTA has. You first of all, you join EFTA, and then you get the European Union to agree that the new member of EFTA signs up to the EEA, where it's already lots of experience. Yeah. And so you have the benefit of the access to the single market without the downside of having lost your sovereignty over your currency. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a no-brainer for us.
I'm increasingly convinced. Compared to the last time we spoke, I definitely see it. I definitely see it more in your in the way you see it. Okay, I wanted to move to the next thing. Given the legal, fiasco that has unfurled before us with the Scottish government and Alex Salmond and trying to basically imprison him for life for being a potential political rival, which he now is anyway. What do you see as the leaving aside the actors involved? What do you see as the main structural issues in the Scottish government that should be resolved or that should be fixed so that something like this can't happen again?
I didn't vote to set up the Scottish Parliament in the referendum because I read the white paper. Mm-hmm. And when I read the white paper, I said to Margot, I'm not voting for this. I might have voted for this 20 years ago, and I would have voted for it 20 years ago. I left the Labour Party over the question of devolution in a very mild assembly, very mild, compared to what was offered by Donald Dewar and Tony Blair. But we had moved on. Scotland had been deindustrialised. We needed far more economic powers than were being presented there. And I was also very worried about what I regarded as utter naivety, that somehow or other we would set up a parliament that would be different from Westminster. We'd all be Jock Tamson's bairns. We might disagree, but it'd be done in a very civilised manner. It'd be a really nice place. And that's why we've got that semicircle, debating chamber.
Yeah.
Well, we've been part of the British state for 300 years. We've been part of the political process for 300 years. And the political process in all parts of the UK is adversarial. You can't help it. That's just how it has been. We've been brought up like that. So I thought this is an absolute bunkum from start to finish. These are naive people who, in my view, either have lost their marbles in politics or don't know anything about it. So we get the 1998 Act. We didn't make the Scottish Parliament. We Scots didn't make it. It was made by Westminster. And it was interesting that David Davis made this point in his speech in the House of Commons.
I saw that, yeah.
Yes, I mean, the man was quite right. Westminster, this is what we call a creature of statute. And unlike Westminster, which evolved over time, we get it. This is what you do. And it's highly prescriptive, by the way. If you read the 1998 Act, it tells you will have a standing order, it will have this, you will have a corporate body, you will do this, you will do that. No evolution of the institution allowed because it's tightly done by this statute.
Yes, yes.
So I think you have to look at, we need to make significant changes to the Parliament. And one of the structural defects is the list system. Now, there are two list systems that operate in the Western democracies. One is the open list system, where a party nominates, say, 12 people, but they are made known to the electorate, and the electorate can pick number 12 instead of number 1 if the elector wants. We have the closed system, where the party puts up 1 to 12. It doesn't tell the electors who they are.
I didn't know that.
No.
I didn't know that. So they're it's just a list with no names?
No. The party's name goes on the list.
Oh, okay.
And the party symbol. The difference between Margot got in because Margot was an individual.
No, I didn't know that. So you just have a party, you vote for a party list and that's it. They don't even specify who's on the list.
No, but the party gives the returning officer the list of 12 names. Mm-hmm. And, depending how it works out, if it's 1, 2, 3 get in, and then he'll announce these 3 winners. And that's the first time you've heard about them. I mean, we have the position, I live in Edinburgh, in Lothian region. We have the position where number 1 on the Lothian list is a councillor from Glasgow.
I know who you're speaking of. Yes.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't know, the guy can be good, bad, or indifferent. I mean, it's ludicrous that a Glasgow councillor who knows nothing about the problems of Edinburgh and the Lothians is number 1 in the list. And the public, there's a number of them know it, but it's not generally known. And anyway, if you want to vote SNP, whether you like it or not, that's who you're going to get. Yeah. So, and it also has the effect, it has developed over time, of giving the party leadership total control. Mm-hmm. And Margaret MacDonald is a very good example. 1999, she was number 1 on the Lothian list. Margot, a very, very independent-minded person, regarded by the leadership as a bloody nuisance. And
was she in the SNP or independent? As you said?
She was SNP, right. Number 1 in the SNP list. But she also stood in a constituency because at that time, before you could be considered for the list, you had to be in a constituency. You had to be fighting. But anyway, Margot was well known. Comes the next time, the party want rid of Margot. Down the list she goes to an impossible position. And so they say, well, that's got rid of that bloody nuisance. Now, that was a message to everybody. Yeah. You're not Margot MacDonald. In fact, there was another MSP who was a bloody nuisance to them. Dorothy Grace Elder is her name. Brilliant journalist, one of the best health campaigners we've had in Scotland for many a year, but she was a bloody nuisance. So Dorothy, no chance, because Dorothy wasn't nationally known like Margot. So they thought they had got rid of two bloody nuisances. And the message was, you become a bloody nuisance, pal, and you're down the list and you're out. And that enabled the party leadership, which by then was developing the cult of personality, to become even more controlling than it had been previously. That's why, since 1999, there has never been a revolt on the SNP backbenches. Now, Mark, you know as well as I do that in every single democratic parliamentary institution in the Western world, the leadership doesn't always get its way, that you have lots of people standing up in the backbenches who are either prepared to disagree or even vote against them. I mean, you've got to take your hat off to the Tory MPs in Westminster on the question of the pandemic controls. Johnson can't control them. SNP, no revolts at all, because if you dared revolt, you've had it. So that's one of the first structural things we have to look at. Then you've got to look at the position of the Lord Advocate and create the Crown Office as a quite separate prosecuting organisation, separate, no links to the government whatsoever. And you can keep the Lord Advocate as the legal advisor, the way the Attorney General is the legal advisor to the government in Westminster. But the prosecution is done by a separate body, the Crown Prosecution Service. That's a couple of fundamentals. The other problem, and it's not at all a popular one, indeed I would say it's highly unpopular, and that is, I don't think we pay enough for our MSPs, because what has developed is a political elite. Hamza Yusuf is an excellent example. He is the Justice Minister who knows nothing about Scots law at all. Hamza cut his teeth in politics by being a researcher, and another researcher, then a member of the Scottish Parliament, then a minister. Where is the wide work experience that one looks for from someone who's going to make law? And you can look at the whole lot of them. We now have a political elite. Where's the working class? Where's the working class in that parliament? The working class is a big, substantial part of our community. It has its own special problems. In Edinburgh, in Craigmillar, a deprived part of Edinburgh, it is represented by a middle-class woman, SNP, from the borders, who sends her children to a private school. A working-class area, deprived, represented. Now, she's a very nice woman, but there is no way she could ever feel in her gut what is required in a working-class area. So we got a problem. Now, not just working-class folk. Where's the scientist? Where's the junior university professor? There's not many business people in the Scottish Parliament. Because if I'm a junior lecturer and I'm going up the university ladder, am I going to take the chance of losing higher pay later on, going into a parliament where I might be bumped in 3 or 4 years' time? So, we've got to look at what we pay our MPs. How would you set up a compensation fund? This is really unpopular. How would you set up a compensation fund so that if someone took a career break and was unlucky enough to be defeated, there would be some substantial sum of money that would see them through the bad times for retraining? Because if you're talking about a constituency MSP, it's a very peculiar job. The moment you're elected, there are hundreds of people in your opponents working day and night to unelect you at the next election. So, that precariousness has got to be looked at as well. But I think fundamentally, you're talking about, and that's the lesson of the salmon fiasco, is get the prosecution service totally and completely removed from any connection with the government. I mean, we're at the situation where, Peter Fraser is able to describe the Lord Advocate as being politically corrupted. What? That's never happened in modern Scotland. No doubt during the days of James VI, we had politically corrupt Lord Advocates. We haven't had it in modern times until now. So there's something wrong in the state of Scotland that stinks, that we've got to sort out by saying we need to have a constitutional commission of our own to say how we're going to address the structural problems of this Parliament and make sure it never happens again.
Yeah. Yeah. And what do you know about the degree of lobbying and the level of corruption of the corruption of money within the Scottish Parliament? I used to teach courses in campaign finance in the U.S. political system. I can't imagine it's as bad a grave a problem in Scotland as it is in the United States. But if you could comment a little bit about what you know about the role of money in politics and to what degree it's a corrupting force.
Well, the problem for all political parties is like a soldier with a rifle. It's not any good unless you get bullets in them. And, money is bullets in the rifle of a political party. Right. So there's always the temp. But I think we're actually fairly clean on that.
That's my perception as well.
Yeah. When I say, politically corrupt, I don't mean somebody stashing stuff in the back pocket. It's not that at all. I think we're fairly clean. Where there is anxiety and where the tentacles of political corruption go out into civic society is the funding from central government to a number of organizations that are charities and quasi-charities and pressure groups. Mm-hmm. And if that central government funding gets to the point where it is in fact the lifeline of those organizations, mm-hmm. then they're going to be most reluctant to criticize the person who actually pays them. Right. And I think there's been what I would call a soft corruption of civic society because of the way things have been funded. Mm-hmm. And it's very difficult, by the way. You try an FOI and try and find out where the money that's laid aside to assist organizations, where it goes and who pays. It's all scrambled egg stuff. Yeah. So, I think that's something that would have to be looked at. I personally would argue that no government funding should go to any external organization except with the permission of a parliamentary committee. Mm-hmm. But that takes me to another structural problem. Mm-hmm. And that is the number of MSPs in relation to the functions they have to carry out. Mm-hmm. 129 sounds a lot. But once you take account of the people who have to form a government, then you're getting into much smaller numbers. And they have to form the committees. And the committees have a dual role. One is investigatory and also legislative.
Regulatory, yeah.
Yeah. And now, most people would agree that it hasn't worked very well. So I would have more MSPs in order that you can man committees properly, because calling the government to account is really through the committee system, mm-hmm. as happens in the House of Commons. Mm-hmm. And at the moment, really basically the party leaders decide who's going to be on a committee. Whereas in the House of Commons votes for who's going to be the chairman of a committee. Yeah. So now that increases the status and standing of the chairman of a committee, because he's not bound to the government or the government whips. and it increases the standing and status of the committee of which he's chair. It's a new power base. And that's what I would like to see happen in the Scottish Parliament. More MSPs and the committees split between legislative and interrogatory.
Okay. All right. With the remaining time, I'd like to go over some of the questions that we've had. Let's see. Is Alba standing in all of the different list districts? I believe they are. I believe that they're standing in all of the different.
Yes, I understand that they are.
Yeah, okay. Do you think that the SNP Alba supermajority, with Alba creating an official opposition, working in collaboration with the SNP, and therefore kicking the red, blue, and yellow Tories to the fringes of the Holyrood, would deal the final death blow to the Unionist parties? Or do you think that such a collaboration between SNP and Alba would mean the end of the Unionist parties?
I'm not sure about Labour. I doubt if it would the Tories. The Tories are a Unionist party. You know, one of the things that we nationalists have got to do is understand that our fellow Scots who don't agree with us are not enemies, they're opponents. They're not traitors. It's perfectly British. They're perfectly reasonable for them to see themselves as both British and Scots. Now, that might offend a lot who think I'm just a Scot, but that's how a lot of people think. And after 300 years, there are bound to be reasons for that. Mm-hmm. No, there's been integration of families and culture. Trade union movement is a very good example of it. So I think we've got to be a bit more respectful to some of our fellow Scots. I'm not sure about Labour. One of the things we haven't talked about, and it's a potential that better be faced, the Johnson government's going to love bomb us. We're going to get more union. That won't work. After that won't work, we should really pay attention to some of the thinking that's been going on in England since 2014. Mm-hmm. The Constitutional Reform Group have produced a new Act of Union bill to have a kind of federal relationship between England, Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland. Its sponsor in the House of Lords is Lord Lisvane, who's the former Chief Clerk of the House of Commons, not a man given to triviality. There have been significant opinion formers in England writing over the last 2 or 3 years that the way to solve the Scottish question is to have a federalist type solution. Ben Thompson has written a book called Home Rule, and I'd advise everybody in the independence movement to read it, because Ben sets out a very detailed and very good case for Devo Max. And what happens when love bombing doesn't work and Boris Johnson is faced with the inevitability of a referendum? What if he puts Devo Max against independence on the ballot paper? We can't complain about that because that's what Alex Salmond wanted in 2014 and David Cameron wouldn't allow it. And how can you object when independence is on the ballot paper? This is what I meant when earlier on I talked about we need much more sophisticated thinking than has been happening in recent years. Are we prepared for that? And you know, it's a very seductive case, Home Rule. Lots of power, hardly anything left at Westminster, defence and foreign affairs, no problem with the border, no problem with money, still sterling, no problem with the old age pension, absolutely guaranteed because you're in the UK. Highly seductive. We have to be able to put an argument of sovereignty against that. And at the moment, I'm just finishing a second book on Scottish politics, where I've taken on Ben Thompson, because I've said to myself, look, this is important. If we are suddenly landed with independence versus Devo Max, and we've done no preparation, we're not in a very good position to win. You know, so Anybody who thinks, you get a super majority and the game's all over, we've won out the park 6-0 at Wembley, that is not true. We've got more thinking to do and more deep thinking to do and better organisation to do at the present time.
Okay. A couple ones about voting SNP 1 and 2, voting SNP 1 and Alba 2. How do you see that? And the fact that one of the questions addressed, why is the SNP so against SNP 1 and Alba 2? So there were three or so questions that addressed that. So just to get your view on that.
Well, this is a lack of leadership, because this idea of another independence party, as it were, taking the less votes is not new. It was floated about 3 years ago, maybe 2 years ago. I might not be quite right about 3. And the SNP rejected it. And people like me were saying, well, are you mad? Why don't you bring those people in and have a chat with them and you get an agreement? Why don't you say to them, we'll put SNP people on your list, members of the party on your list, which guarantees us some degree of influence? Rejected, because they want to win, and they alone want to win, because they've made the fundamental error of believing that the SNP is the independence movement, but it's only part of the independence movement. There's lots of other people who are not happy with the SNP as a party, but want independence. So they've missed the boat. But what you've got here is nationalist sectarianism on the part of the SNP. It's us alone or nobody else. And that's utter stupidity, because I don't think the polls are right, but let us assume they are. The polls say you're within touching distance, but you might be 1 or 2 short. And this other organisation standing on the list, if you don't stand there, can deliver 25, 30 seats. Don't you want them? And the answer at the moment is no, we don't.
Yeah.
And that makes you wonder, Mark, are they really after independence, or just after the joys and pleasures of being the government?
I've thought along those lines as well, and we're certainly not the only two. Here we're getting into the notion of sovereignty, which we just discussed before. And I remember when I first saw you speak in Glasgow, and we had a drink, and you looked over that constitution that I'd done, and then we went to the thing. I remember one of your most eloquent lines was the idea that between when polls opened and polls closed, that Scots had sovereignty, and that you should use it to become independent, obviously, but as we've seen with the reaffirmation of the claim of right back in 2018, Scots have never lost the sovereignty. So couldn't Scots just claim? I mean, if they have the sovereignty, can't they use it? Or are you looking at more of the kind of the Westminster view of sovereignty, that they're giving it to Scots for this limited period of time, and that we should use it? How do you see it? I mean, because I think a lot of people would say, well, we've always had sovereignty. We affirmed it in 1320. It was retained in the Act of Union. It was reaffirmed in the Claim of Right as recently as 2018. How do you see that kind of contradiction in the sovereignty, and how Scots should Scots perceive their sovereignty at this point?
That's where I depart from a lot of my colleagues. I'm in the realist school of international politics. It's emotional for us to claim we've never lost sovereignty. We actually had it on that date in September between the hours of 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. because London said, it's up to you. Here you are. I mean, in that time, we were sovereign. We made the decision, and we decided to give it away back. You can make as many claim of rights as you like, but in a ballot box, we gave it back. We had it and gave it back. So we're not sovereign. We have to regain that sovereignty. That's what we don't have it. If we had it, we'd be independent now. I mean, do you think you can go down to Westminster knock on 10 Downing Street and say, hey, here's the claim of right, pal. We're sovereign. They shut the door on you. What the hell do you do? If, in fact, you have a ballot box decision that says this is about sovereignty, that's a different kettle of fish. There's substance to that. And, we have to stop thinking emotionally. We have to start thinking in Scottish state interest terms, which we haven't done for 300 years. We have to start thinking objectively, which we haven't done for a long time. The problem is, for the last 6.5 wasted years, all that's been required at an SNP party conference is for Nicola Sturgeon to get up and use the word independence half a dozen times in a speech, and the blood rushes to the head.
I can attest to that. I went to the last 6 SNP conferences, and that was always the highlight. This cult of personality. Oh, there will be an independence! Yay! And everybody leaves. That's the end of the conference, and then not much happens.
Mark, I'm writing this book, and I've talked about state. June 2014, I did 99 meetings I counted. And I would say to an audience about state interest, they didn't know what I meant. Because we have not thought in those lines. We've left that big issue to the big question down in London for 300 years. And until we get that into our head, we're talking about a different framework mentality to achieve independence, and the one that's taken us, up the hill so far. It's like climbing Mount Everest. Okay, you get up. What's the bit that's the hardest? Is that hard last wee bit. And you really have to be very well trained to make that last wee bit. We're not well trained enough, and that's our responsibility. Where has been the political education since 2014? During 2014, I reckon the Scots became the best politically educated people in the whole of Western Europe. There was a real dialogue about where this country is and where we should go. That was the opportunity to maintain it, maintain the structure of the independence movement, do the political education constantly. Oh God, because a leadership doesn't want a well-educated membership and a wide Scottish population. They might ask too many questions.
Yep. And that leads me on to my last couple of questions. What are your thoughts on a Scottish constitution? A lot of the former British colonies have sort of had a Westminster model, whether you talk about Australia or New Zealand or Canada, that had their their constitution was very heavily influenced by the Westminster model. In my view, I would want to. You're free to disagree, but I would want to get as far away from that as possible in certain ways. How do you see it? To what extent should a Scottish constitution emulate what is a constitutional tradition here with regard to Westminster? And in what ways do you think it should depart or be very different from it?
I think we break away from that entirely. During 2014 and since, very little, there's people like yourself and others have done work on a written constitution, but it hasn't figured greatly, and yet it's one of the most important things. If you want to make sure that an independent Scotland does not see what we have seen in the Salmond fiasco affair, then the written constitution is the safeguard. And I would rather have the American model, where you clearly establish the principles and values that you think should, in fact, govern the government and the citizens of a country. Nothing to do with Westminster whatsoever. And I think if anybody really wants to make a major contribution to Scottish independence, we should realise that, okay, getting it matters, but what happens afterwards matters even more. And I would like to see more work done on the written constitution. Some people have talked to me and said, oh, we would like guaranteed housing in a written constitution. But that is policy. So you could guarantee all sorts of things that are beneficial to society. But then governments have to govern and governments have to choose priorities. And let's say you had three absolutely essential social policies in the written constitution, but there wasn't enough money to do the three of them. And everyone else would have to go by the board. So I think when we come to do the written constitution, we have to clearly distinguish between what is policy and what are the principles of a constitution. Yeah. And one of the things that we haven't got across to people is that a written constitution gives the ordinary citizen power over the government. Now, America's, not the gold standard by any means.
No.
Yet, if you look at the history, individuals can take their government and overturn government laws and actions. Yeah. Not a bad constitution.
Yeah, the civil rights movement's a good example of that. And
So I think I would look at the American model, and you would learn a great deal from how it's developed and the amendments and how the Supreme Court have dealt with it, so that we get a better model than the American model, but based on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. And finally, this is your opportunity to plug your books. And what are you working on in your books, and when are they coming out, just so that people can be aware?
Well, my memoir was finished last autumn, but the pandemic jiggered every publisher in the country up, and they've asked me to, because I thought last autumn that was me. I was going back into retirement, as it were. But then, the salmon affair has occurred, and then there was the hate crime bill. I've taken part in the campaign against that. So I've got to add that part to the memoir. But as I watched the salmon sturgeon issue develop in the Scottish Parliament, I began to worry. And then Ben Thompson produced his book, and that set alarm bells off in me. Mm-hmm. And I sort of thought, well,
just remind me, which was the Ben Thompson book about federalism? Was it?
No, Devo Max, actually. No, okay. Ben talks about a kind of quasi-federal, but it's Devo Max plus, if you like to put it that way. And that reignited my energy, and so I wrote the first draft. And the publisher, to be fair to him, Hugh, said to me, look, you're concerned with more than just, that issue. It's important, however it is. But I was talking to him about other issues. He says, why don't you widen it out to have a look at the structural defects in Scottish politics, the structural defects in the Scottish Parliament? So that's what I've done. And I've done the first draft. I'm going to wait again after the 6th of May to bring it up to date. So the memoirs and this other book on Scottish politics are going to come out sometime round about July or August.
Okay. Well, you're more than welcome to come back on the show and talk about it. I'd be delighted to have you. And it's certainly been a absolutely fascinating conversation. And I thank you so much, Jim, for your time and sharing all of your insight with us this evening.
Well, thank you. And thank everybody who's been watching. I've thoroughly enjoyed the opportunity to be able to expand rather than be given 20 seconds to tell the world whether I believe in atomic energy or not.
Okay. And if you could hang on just for a couple minutes after he stops it.